Hello everyone, I'm Teresa Miller and welcome back to a whole new season of Writing Out Loud interviews. My guest today is the noted author, Dr. Darcy O'Brien.
Hi, Teresa.
Hi, Darcy. Thanks for joining us. You've written so many different works, novels, critiques, nonfiction books. Your latest is Power to Hurt. What keeps you going as a writer?
You mean other than paying the taxes on my house?
Other than paying those taxes, which I understand are pretty steep.
I think the main impetus is that, or it's two things. One, everybody in the world, I believe, has a talent, and this is my talent. My English teachers in high school recognized that I don't really do anything else very well. I cook ribs fairly well, but other than that, and so you want to go after your own talent and try to exploit it to the extent that you can. But the other thing is my fascination with people and with the kinds of dramatic situations that I get involved in doing these books. I feel very lost and purposeless if I'm not involved in one of these projects. So there's really no choice involved. This is what makes me happy, and so I do it.
In recent years, you've had enormous success in writing about crime, and I understand that you don't like that title, true crime. Is that correct?
Well, it's become a label for a genre that is full of a lot of trash, and so I naturally feel uneasy about being associated with a lot of books that I don't think are really much above the very low tabloid level. However, the founder of the genre was really Truman Capote, and his book In Cold Blood is a classic, and there have been other wonderful books, Blood and Money by Tommy Thompson, The Executioner's Song by Norman Mailer, and several others. But a lot of these books are simply about violence. They're simply exploitive of murder or mayhem of one kind or another, and they don't go into what I'm really interested in, which is the social milieu and the context and the ripple effect of crime. What? So, I mean, people label you, and there's not much to do about it. My new book is actually published as current affairs because it involves a legal case, but I noticed the bookstores are putting it in true crime anyway, so you can't help it.
There's slots to fill.
Right.
What got you involved in writing about crime in the first place?
I think I've always been fascinated by questions of good and evil. One of my earliest memories is hearing, and I must have been 6 or 7, Edward R. Murrow's broadcast on CBS of the liberation of Buchenwald. And I think World War II, for most people of my generation, is the kind of touchstone, and the question of how this could have happened, the Holocaust and so forth, has always been central to my sensibility. And the other thing is that a courtroom and legal cases are one of the few places, perhaps the only place, where different levels of American society come together, and you can overcome that problem of being in this niche or that niche because you've got different economic and social levels all coming together in a law case. So I was naturally drawn because of my interest in good and evil, and also because of my fascination with the different levels of society, to legal situations and to crime, to the question of sin. I went to Catholic school. I don't think you ever get over that, no matter how often you go to church. And I do see life in terms of choices, moral choices, which is why I'm very impatient with a lot of psychobabble and contemporary psychological obsession, because I do see life in moral terms. And so I think it was natural for me to get into crime, although, as you know, the real impetus was that my college roommate and high school friend, Ronald George, who's just been made Chief Justice of the state of California, turned out to be the judge on the Hillside Stranglers case. And when I was talking to him about that case, I suddenly realized, wait a minute, this is much more interesting and involving than anything I'm dreaming up at the moment. And so I pursued it as a book. And as my favorite Irish poet, or one of them, Patrick Kavanagh, says, a man dabbles in something and it becomes his life. He was talking about poetry, but in my case it's crime.
And when it does become your life, Darcy, and I know you research extensively, is there a dark side to that? Do you sometimes spend so much time dwelling on crime that you are looking over your shoulder, so to speak?
Oh, I think it's definitely got a negative side to it. One of my books, A Way of Life Like Any Other, is primarily a comic novel, although it has its tragic impulses. And I think of myself as someone who's always drawn toward comedy, but the sense of joy that comedy implies is really under pressure when you're involved, like a homicide detective, as I am, in these underbelly aspects of life, these negative things. On the other hand, what one finds usually, and what I look for, are inspirational examples of how people deal with tragedy and deal with violence and deal with terrible situations. I think this book, Power to Hurt, is the one that I found the most inspirational factors in. There are really very good people involved in this, and they survived and triumphed over very negative things. So there's a trade-off. I mean, you know, you're in a kind of warlike situation dealing with these matters, but you find inspiration.
Tell us a little bit about the background of
Excuse me.
Power to Hurt.
The background of it has to do with a law case that is currently being appealed to the U.S. Supreme Court. David Lanier, who was a state judge in Tennessee, was the first judge ever convicted and sent to jail for violating criminal civil rights statutes. He not only abused but attacked, physically assaulted sexually, including oral rape, various women who came to see him in his capacity as judge in a state courthouse in western Tennessee. He attacked these women wearing his robes in his chambers, and then told them that he would take their children away from them if they told. He was under investigation by the FBI for political corruption, and in the course of this investigation, one agent who was a very courageous and good guy, Bill Castleberry, uncovered these horror stories about women, eventually brought them to the Justice Department, and they prosecuted under a civil rights statute, and he was convicted. Unfortunately, he's since been released because of what I think is a ridiculous decision by the Sixth Circuit Court of Appeals. And we can talk about that if you want.
Oh, I'd like
They
to.
said it should have been a state case rather than a federal case. Point A, the judge's brother was the district attorney. I mean, there was going to be no state case. So it's a very serious case, and at the moment it's the most serious setback to civil rights and women's rights, I believe, in this century, and most people agree with me. So it should be better known than it is already. People are becoming aware of it. It's mind-boggling in terms of its implications, and we're hoping that the Supreme Court will hear the case and do the right thing and reverse the Sixth Circuit's reversal of Lanier's convictions.
Obviously, you didn't go into this naively. How did you get involved in this?
Actually, what happened was, I mean, one is always looking for stories, but my wife Suzanne took a phone call one day from a U.S. Attorney in Memphis who was asking us for a character reference regarding something totally irrelevant. And Suzanne had the wit to say, "Are you working on any interesting cases lately?" And an hour and a half later, she said, "Would you talk to my husband?" And he had read some of my books. And that was my first contact. But the real trigger was when I met some of the women who had been victimized by this judge. And I'll never forget one day talking to one woman who's still so frightened she doesn't want a real name used. I call her Mary Harrelson in the book. This was in the corridor of the federal courthouse in Memphis, and she started telling me about how Lanier not only had tried to attack her sexually, physically, but it also then, when she refused and he fired her as his secretary, he prevented her from getting employment. And she had finally got a job as a bank officer or teller or whatever. And they fired her when they found out that she was going to testify against Lanier before a grand jury. And when she started talking to me about this, she began trembling. That did it. I mean, I realized that I was ignorant of the extent of the emotional effect of this kind of experience. You know, one can read about it, one can rationalize about it, theorize about it, but until you meet someone who has been through something like that, you don't know the extent of the effect. And I thought then, okay, this is, you know, I have to write this.
At that point, would you say that this became more than a story to you, that it almost became a cause as well?
Yeah, and I felt that way about the Hillside Stranglers book, because that case would not have been brought if it hadn't been for my pal, Ron George, who refused to allow the DA to drop it. So there was a kind of cause involved, but this is different. I do feel part of a larger group and cause in this. I feel that I am writing for the women and for the very good law enforcement people and the prosecutors who really were devoted to this case.
Even though you have been exposed to the judicial system and have done a lot of research with your other books, did you find some surprises in this? Were there some things that even shocked you?
Yes. I think I was reminded, or that I came to a realization more than I ever had before, of how tenuous, how fragile our democratic rights really are. I mean, what we have here, this civil rights issue involving these women, is the right to personal liberty, to what legally is called bodily integrity. And the issue is, does a state government official have the right to deprive you of your personal liberty? Is this right to personal freedom and freedom from assault guaranteed by the U.S. Constitution? Well, most federal circuits have said, yes, indeed it is. But this circuit, the Sixth, has said, no, it's not. It's a state matter. But the reason for the federal government, as James Madison wrote in the Federalist Papers, number 10, is to protect citizens from local tyranny, from local factions. And that's what this case is about. A local tyranny tyrannized, terrorized, and deprived these women of their personal liberty. That's when the feds have to come in. Now this higher court is saying they shouldn't have come in. Well, it's absurd. Now, what shocked me and what I realized was how easily what seems to be such an obvious right can be abrogated, can be taken away. And you realize you cherish more deeply American values and American rights, but you realize that they have to be fought for every day and articulated every day.
Well, it is an amazing story. Have you met the judge?
Well, I've met him, but he wouldn't talk to me.
I wonder why.
I tried to play it cool to begin with, but I told the FBI agent Bill Castleberry that he ruined any possibility that the judge would talk to me by coming up to me and throwing his arm around me during a legal proceeding, and Lanier was watching, so it was
you were
all
the
over.
feds.
I was trying, right. I became, my allegiances my cover was blown at that moment. And I said to the FBI agent, I said, don't you know how to cover for somebody? Anyway, Lanier, if he'd read any of my other books or heard about them, he would have known that I'm not particularly sympathetic to criminals, but he still might have talked to me, but he refused. But I did have access to his friends, family. I saw him in court. I learned a great deal about him. And he did give interviews to other people, so I had access to those.
Darcy, we want to talk more about this with you. Can you stay around for a second segment?
Bet.
We'll be back after a brief message with more with Dr. Darcy O'Brien.
This is an RSU-TV encore presentation of Writing Out Loud.
Welcome back to Writing Out Loud, an interview with Dr. Darcy O'Brien, the author of Power to Hurt. Darcy, a lot of us would like to think that, okay, this happened in a little town in Tennessee, that this is an isolated incident. Do you view it as an isolated incident?
No, and not at all. And that's interesting you say that, because when I I read about this case in the New York Times, and I pictured a completely remote, like a town up in a holler somewhere. In fact, Dyersburg is a very prosperous town, less than 2 hours on very good highways from Memphis. There's no unemployment. It's roughly 18 to 20,000 people, good education system. So these are not particularly backward or remote people. And there is a Southern aspect to it in that this was a family dynasty that this corrupt judge headed, and his brother was the DA and so forth and so on. His daddy had founded the dynasty in the 1930s. And that is a little more Southern than you'd find in California or other places. But basically it's the kind of thing that happens all the time. And on my book signing tours around and so forth, as well as from other connections, women come out and say, this is something similar has happened to me. Every working woman has had this kind of experience. I think it's much more common than we know, which is all the more reason to see this case as representative, not isolated. It's not just a regional story, it's a national story.
As you research this, are there some risks to you? Risk to you physically? I mean, did you ever feel in danger at any point? Because this is not a nice guy that we're talking about. And what about in terms of lawsuits?
As far as I know, he has never, to answer the first question first, Lanier goes after the weak. The women that he picked, like a wolf going after, the weakest sheep in the herd. The women that he picked generally had serious problems that he knew about and that he could exploit, and he would use his legal position to do that. I know that you've been taking marijuana, you've been doing this, so forth. You either do what I ask you to, or I'm going to expose this. Or they had a child custody thing, maybe nothing illegal, but just a child custody problem. By the way, Dyer County has the highest divorce rate, or has always been near 1 or 2 of any county in the United States, including Clark in Nevada, which is where Las Vegas is. Why this is, I don't know, but the point is that he had a lot of family problems to exploit. But he would go after the weak, and I don't really consider myself vulnerable to him. He's never done anything physically violent to a male, only to females, except 10 days ago, CNN got him to do an interview. It's called CNN Presents, and the interviewer asked a question to Lanier about forced sex, and Lanier lost it. He bowled over the cameraman. He went after the throat of the CNN reporter, Mark Feldstein. Fortunately, they had another camera going. And that's the only instance I know of his getting physically violent with a male. And this is all going to be broadcast on CNN Presents, and a feature about my book and so forth. And I mean, if I'm gloating, it's because finally, on camera, everything the women said about this man is shown. I mean, this bland, he's not a big daddy Southern type at all. He's very bland. He almost has no personality. It was hard to describe him in that sense. But there's this other side, and only these women who were his victims had seen it. Now it's going to be on national TV, as well as in my book. But I'm gratified that this has been filmed. So no, I'm not worried. As far as the legal thing is, people sue all the time. I mean, there is one lawsuit. I'm not supposed to talk about it. But when you do these sorts of books, the most important thing is to be as thorough as possible in your documentation. And it doesn't have footnotes. It's not an academic book. But believe me, my files are very thorough. So if anybody wants to sue me, watch out.
Watch out. On my way to the interview today, I was thinking this is one of the first books that Darcy has done, nonfiction books, that didn't focus on a murder. But that's not altogether true, is it, in a way?
Well, it is a murder of the spirit. One of the people that gave me comments for the book, Tom Flanagan, the novelist, made that point that it seems to be a departure, and yet this is a kind of killing that in some ways is even more difficult to deal with than homicide, because homicide is over for the victim once it takes place. These women have to live with this memory and relive it constantly, particularly now that Lanier is out. We hope he'll eventually be returned to jail, but this is something that just goes on. And any rape victim or victim of assault can tell you the same story, that it's something that becomes, the important thing is to be able to live with it, and to escape the obsession with it. It's exactly parallel to a war experience. It's the same as being shell-shocked in the old term. The psychologists like to call it post-traumatic stress syndrome. Whatever you want to call it, it's a kind of thing that can define your life, and it goes on and on. And this is a kind of murder, although it's not literal murder.
Not literal. I like what you said, murder of the spirit. In fact, it is that. What about closure for you? This is ongoing, and as a writer, you can't say that this book is over for you, can you?
No. To a certain extent, that's true of any nonfiction book, because the people involved, particularly if you're interested more in the ripple effects of a crime or a situation as I am, rather than in just the crime itself, it never ends. But in this case, it goes on. I will be able to write an additional chapter for the paperback edition. There will be a certain amount of resolution in terms of whether the U.S. Supreme Court hears this or not, and then, of course, what they decide. One of the dissenting judges in the Sixth Circuit, Martha Daughtry, said that this decision to release Lanier goes against 780 years of Anglo-American jurisprudence. What she said, she wrote that it abrogates or invalidates Magna Carta, which was in 1215 the first advance toward human liberty. It only involved male nobles, but it was our first step toward the kinds of liberties that we enjoy under the Bill of Rights. And we know how rare they are around the world. And this decision undercuts those basic human rights, Martha Daughtry wrote, and I think she's absolutely right. So we'll see what happens with this.
And, you know, and it seems to me that the judge, and I use the term loosely, had no redeeming virtues to speak of. He was so
well,
absolutely awful.
Of course, one wishes to believe that everyone has some redeeming virtues. A friend of mine who's a defense attorney once told me about a certain client. I can't defend somebody unless I can find some redeeming virtue, and I just couldn't find any with this guy. And Bill Castleberry, the FBI agent, said that he had arrested 500 people in his career, all of whom went to jail, and of those, only 3 he considered truly evil, and Judge Lanier was one of the 3, the other 2 being mass killers. However, I found myself feeling sorry for him on 2 occasions. One, when he was first sent to jail, he had violated his bond by trying to contact witnesses to get them to change their testimony. But there was something about seeing him stripped of his jacket, handcuffed and shackled, with his daughters crying and his ex-wife even with her head in her hands, that made me feel sorry for him, even though I didn't want to. But then a woman psychologist, Professor Louise Fitzgerald, who was very prominent in the case, said, I thought so too, but then I remembered that his children, his daughters, are victims too. And when you realize what he's done to them, you know, and then my sympathies went away. I think it's natural. I mean, I don't know what virtues he had. I mean, he didn't even enjoy life. I mean, he was, as his brother said to somebody, I quote him, I don't think he even liked women. You know, the women, I mean, he hated them, obviously, which is why he was attacking them. He didn't party. He didn't seem to enjoy his power. The only way to have sympathy for him, I think, is to see him as a maimed soul. But, you know, his mother committed suicide. His father, you know, was difficult. But I try to avoid that kind of approach, because then you lose the moral distinctions that you need. No, I think he's really, I would use a stronger word if this weren't a family program, but I really think he is, and then fill in the blanks. I don't find, I mean, if there is a hell, he will definitely be in it.
Which really leads us to your title, Power to Hurt. Could you explain where you got the title? Because
well, there's a sonnet of Shakespeare's, number 94, that is about abuse of power, and the first line is, they that have power to hurt and will do none. It is a description of what having power and not abusing it, how that gives you salvation. And the tagline is, lilies that fester smell far worse than weeds. That is something that seems to be beautiful or seems to be powerful in the general sense stinks more if it rots. And a judge, with whom we entrust our lives and who has all this power, stinks or festers worse than someone we don't expect anything of when they become corrupt. So it's a Shakespeare sonnet that I think sums up the whole book. It came to me on an airplane after I'd interviewed some of these people, and I thought that's got to be the title. Fortunately, the publisher did not disagree.
It's a wonderful title. We just have a minute left,
Yeah.
Darcy. What about the women? Are they recovering? Will they recover?
It depends on whom you ask. Obviously, this release has been a terrible setback. Basically, Vivian, my heroine, is doing okay, although she has deep problems with her family, and her mother has not been helpful, and so forth. Two of the women, Sandy Sanders and Patty Walsh, are doing very well because they're very defiant. Another one has completely gone into a tailspin and is suicidal.
Mm-hmm.
Others, I think, are not coping very well. So it's a mixed story as far as that goes.
Well, you certainly did a beautiful job telling it and have done us all a great service. Thank you, Dr. Darcy O'Brien. Thank all of you for joining us on Writing Out Loud.